Spite is a powerful tool to propel oneself forward. Great things can be done out of spite, from art to architecture. It is the fuel that burns most foul. My spite fueled me for the pettiest and most foolhardy 2 weeks, when I decided that was all the time I needed to craft a playable tabletop role-playing game. If you're asking some version of, what's wrong with me? That's the correct response. What drives a person into the thralls of madness? To specifically create a TTRPG with a time crunch as long as Concord's lifespan? The short answer is mostly arrogance. But we'll get to that. To skip over some of the personal bits so I can get to explaining the game sooner, I know somebody who set out to make their own game because of a shared frustration with the limitations of other TTRPGs. We've often found the rules and lore limiting on what we want to play or the stories we want to tell. And I've had my fair share of disagreements with GMs over what was agreed upon homebrew. Some of which were my fault, but we're skipping over those bits. We decided to create a game. This began years ago, and we had plenty of hurdles and disagreements, but the final nail in the coffin was when I realized it wasn't supposed to be a collaborative effort. I distanced myself from the project after being yelled at for, quote, adding too much stuff. It wasn't our game. It was one person's vision that the rest of us were supposed to clap at. About 4 years passed with little going on. Occasionally the theoretical game's existence would be mentioned, and not a whisper more. Until last December, that is. The old group document, from when we assumed it to be a group project, had been abandoned, and we were all gifted a shiny new 23-page long document brimming with never-before-discussed ideas pulled from a scatterbrained singular vision. Since I had learned how valuable my input was, I made sure to only leave comments and never add to the document itself. All those comments were ignored, of course, and nothing was updated for months. In March, I was pestered about the document again. So I took another look during a slow day at work and discovered after 3 months some vapid additions along with an indecipherable and self-contradictory lore. Now, I have an issue reading. That issue being that it causes me physical pain to do so. Even with a page count as short as this document, I don't know why they expected me to read all of it. Against my better judgment, I trusted the misplaced confidence in their own mechanics and half-heartedly agreed that it was probably ready for a playtest without ever having read the other half of the document. I spent so much time commenting on the lore of the game that when they asked if the rest was playable, I was too worn down to question it. It wasn't until later that night I skimmed over the other half of the document and would need to force someone else to read it. There are no words to describe the intense rage that unfortunate person felt reading the supposed rules. This rage exasperated by the claim that it was playable. Even that wasn't the catalyst of my spite. In truth, I do not remember what specific thing pushed me over the edge. Perhaps it was the lack of updates, or the repetitive responses to my every concern. Oh, I intended to add that, with zero follow-through, or them giving some convoluted reasoning for why this bit of lore or this mechanic actually isn't a problem to begin with. So many ideas, but none of them written down to be seen. One Sunday night, maybe I just worked myself into a frenzy, but I got mad. I said I could do better in 2 weeks. I didn't even say this to the person who made me mad. No, just to my brother. This, however, was the real catalyst. A short, trivial quandary. If you made a game, what would it be about? I needed no time to answer. I pointed over his shoulder to where a creation of mine laid. Made when I was 6 or 7 years old. It would be about the Virus King. That night, when I tried to sleep, things went the same as every Sunday night. The rest I needed so desperately evaded me for hours. This time, my mind was filled with thoughts of an arch-villain corrupting our world. Thoughts of survivors needing to fight back. No, just trying to survive the ongoing apocalypse. Then, I drifted into darkness for all too short a time. I tried to hide away at work, like every morning, taking advantage of the quiet while I could, but once again, thoughts of the Virus King kept me awake. Like a hot air balloon, I soared to imagined heights and embarked on my self-imposed challenge to create a playable game in just 2 short weeks, as opposed to the 4+ years someone else had. Those first 2 days flew by as I wrote up the setting and lore of my new game. No name though, names are hard. Describing the Virus King's world and humanity's struggle to survive was easy. I wrote the rulebook in the voice of an in-universe character, because it was one of my rejected suggestions to that other game, and something I really wanted to see done. The character's voice gave me direction to the game. It is not a post-apocalypse, it is a slow burn apocalypse. An arrogance of the Virus King that eclipses even my own. His mere existence in the world has already guaranteed his victory, as it twists and contorts to his shape. He isn't like the viruses we know. He is a biological virus, a computer virus, and a reality virus. In his world, anything can be infected. Anything can become a monster. It began with the animals. They became more aggressive, grew extra claws and fangs. Then humans became infected and turned beastly. Then the computers were infected, and our technology could no longer be trusted. The virus split into 6 unique strains, excluding the King strain, of course. Beast, Spore, Digital, Mechanical, Elemental, and Mimetic. Nothing is safe. And yet, humans persist. Humanity survives. Despite the hopelessness, despite the fear looming in every shadow, we keep going. This is a game about hope in a hopeless world. This is the feeling that came about trying to write from a character's voice in this messed up world. A deeper understanding that could only be gleaned from entering their headspace. The game could not exist without the need to fight back and survive. The author of the book is a man called Sergeant Redacted, mocking his long military career and the many classified secrets he held close to his chest. The sergeant, whose true rank remains a mystery, plays along with the lighthearted jokes like this because he knows keeping up morale in dire times is more important than his own pride. A touch of levity can do wonders to distract distraught hearts. Throughout the rulebook, you can find his thoughts about the Stronghold's unprofessional categorizations, or his befuddlement at names the younger members use. In his old age, this veteran learned which battles are worth fighting, and the names of monsters simply are not worth it. Redacted heads the Appalachia Stronghold's military operations. There are 7 known strongholds around the world, 1 for each continent. I say known because there is a lot of uncertainty in this world. In-universe, this is because of the mimetic strain viruses, which infect any recorded information or can even alter the memories directly in your head. Out of universe, this is so any prospective GMs or players can add or change anything that doesn't fit their story. As the second day drew to a close, I could feel myself slowing down, and I knew exactly why. The specter of burnout had shackled itself to my leg. The easy part was over. The world building was complete, and I had to move on to actual gameplay and mechanics. Sure, I had included small bits already, like the infection gauge, different strains of the virus, and a type advantage chart, but now everything would be those small bits. No longer could I freely write a freakish world of mutants and monsters. I would need to tie myself down and plot a course that a hypothetical player or GM could easily follow. I was scared how everything I would write would not only need to be cohesive, but functional within the constraints of this ever-expanding rule set. The first steps in this path were the infection gauge, a mechanic that balances how often each player's character is able to use their abilities. In this game, you play as an engineered, a volunteer survivor working out of one of the strongholds who was injected with a bioengineered strain of their choosing. This stations them somewhere between human and virus, a superhuman who's not yet changed into a virus, and who needs to keep their infection gauge from exceeding their maximum health, lest they become another monster to be hunted down. The infection gauge increases with each ability used, and certain enemies will increase your infection gauge by spreading their own infection. On the 4th day, I could feel the burnout clawing at my back. Bit by bit, its claws chipped out my drive to create. The first week was nearly over. I could see the halfway mark, and that scared me. There was still too much that needed done. I began building the class level guides for the character creation and a crafting system, trying to focus in on what would be absolutely necessary to call this thing playable. There would be 18 classes in total, 3 per strength. An important decision since an engineered would only be able to multiclass within their own strain. This made it easier to balance the classes, since I wouldn't need to worry about what all 17 other classes could do. I only needed to focus on 2 others while working on one. That also took away the headache of wondering how a dual strain creature would fit into my type advantage chart. The next major mechanic the game needed was crafting and equipping gear. As an engineered, you're constantly on the back foot against the virus threat. Guns and ammo are bountiful, but they do little against any strain of the virus. Crafting weapons and gear to accommodate your weaknesses and strengthen your character are a focal point of the game, and something to give it a little extra personality. Weapons can deal their own strain damage, and armor can defend against specific strains. For instance, a digital strain attack would normally give an additional 1d8 to their damage against the beast strain engineered. However, if said engineered was wearing an insulated jacket, then the type advantage, that additional die, would be negated. By scavenging for materials and harvesting fallen enemies, you'll be able to combine items into stronger weapons and armor for your character to wield. Some items can be crafted by any class, but the higher rarity items require someone with the steampunk class. If you don't have a steampunk in your party, or just pissed yours off, then no worries. You can take items back to the stronghold to ask the resident steampunk to do the crafting for you. Or, if you're lucky, find a wandering steampunk. On the 5th day, the burnout was unbearable. I could barely think straight. The burnout's claws no longer chipped away at me, for they had grown large enough to rip full chunks out of me. But if I was going to complete my 2-week challenge, I knew I couldn't give in to the looming beast. I shifted gears to create the character sheet instead of adding more mechanics, items, enemies, or classes. I had criticized the other supposedly playable game for its lack of a character sheet, so obviously, this was a step I needed to take. The sheet shined light through the gaps in my character creation, allowing me to see the exact bits that needed sealed. With the time limit beating down on me, I finally found something to alleviate that pressure. One aspect in particular that was cleaned up was the equipment. On the sheet, there's a blocky person representing your character, with different slots to assign items to, and being able to visualize this focused my efforts. There are 8 slots in total. The torso holds the armor, the head, arms, and legs can each hold 1 gear, and the hands can each hold 1 weapon or tool. Each piece of gear or armor gives some form of buff to the player. This is especially important because of the 2 scores used to defend yourself in combat. This game has both an armor score and an evasion score, and certain attacks will be able to ignore one of the 2. These scores get a very small boost from your actual stats, and are instead built up by what you have equipped. In other words, the 2 scores are cumulative. Each bit of gear you have equipped can give you a small boost in armor score to add up to a substantial defense, or to increase your evasion, keeping you light on your toes. I've never enjoyed combat in the TTRPGs I've played, whether that be D&D, Pathfinder, or some heavily homebrewed mismatches that I've been pulled into. And as a GM, I've always struggled to try and make combat interesting. Oh, another unlucky roll. I guess your attack that was supposed to be super cool and amazing just bounces off the knight's armor. Wow, so exciting. I think breaking up defense into 2 scores will help keep descriptions interesting, especially if the GM or the players have had a series of bad rolls. I skipped over this, but by this point I had already written the rules for combat. This same idea, the dissatisfaction, informed my vision of combat. Specifically, I had the image of Red Dragon Inn's character cards and how it neatly outlines each character's turn. Combat is organized into different phases: standby, free movement, action, mutation, and conclusion. Before combat proper, there's also a potential prep phase. Whether or not the players get a prep phase depends on how the battle began. Any player who is ambushed or caught unaware of the attacking enemies skips their prep phase. Players who do get a prep phase can change out up to 3 pieces of equipment and use 1 prep action. Changing out gear can be important considering the type matchups of different strains. The prep action could be attempting a stealth roll, or depending on your class, you may have a specific prep action like the steampunk or cryptid class's abilities to transform. Combat begins with the prep phase if applicable. Only player characters get the prep phase with very few exceptions. For example, we'll use our steampunk character, Angel Scott, who might recognize the type of enemy before her and decide to change her equipment to better resist their strain type. For instance, equipping an insulated jacket would resist the elemental damage of a mutated golem. The most important thing for her to do would be transforming with her hinging device, so that she can get bonuses like an increased combat speed and evasion score. Next, all combatants would decide the turn order through agility rolls. Let's say our steampunk rolled a 15 and added their agility bonus of +1. 16 is good roll and the mutated golems are slow creatures, so she gets the first turn. In the standby phase, certain effects or cooldowns would go off, so nothing would happen on the first turn of combat. Then, Angel gets her free movement phase and may move once up to her maximum combat speed at no cost. Then during the action phase, she would get to perform any actions. You have up to 3 actions per turn. These include things like using weapons, abilities, eating food, performing an additional movement, or taking a vaccine to reduce your infection gauge. Afterwards, she would enter her mutation phase, a special phase for abilities akin to an ultimate attack. Each class gets their mutation ability at level 4, and it can be used once per long rest. At levels 8 and 10, you get an upgraded version of that mutation ability, and at level 9, you are able to use a mutation ability twice per long rest. Powerful viruses and bosses also have mutation abilities, making them more dangerous than other enemies. Since I made the game, Angel gets a special mutation ability which combines the 3 possible mutation abilities of the steampunk class. This definitely isn't me cheating at my own game. The rules said it was fine. Her ability would deal 3d8 King Strain damage in a straight line twice her combat speed long. In other words, this would do a lot of damage. But you have to be careful about when you choose to unleash that kind of power. You only get 1 per long rest, and that next enemy could always be more fearsome. Lastly, she enters the conclusion phase where abilities like transformations could wear off, and most damage over time effects activate. Since this is only her first turn, nothing would happen this round, and the next player or enemy in the turn order would begin their turn. One feature I've been excited about is Daikaiju combat. It doesn't affect the mechanics of combat itself, but it does give it an interesting new feel, something to shake up the boring old battles. Daikaiju, a Japanese word meaning large strange creature, are a special class of enemy that function differently from normal enemies because of their large size. For something to be considered a Daikaiju, it must be at least comparable to a building in size. A creature like this is divided into its core and its limbs, each having their own health. While the Daikaiju still has limbs to defend itself, meaning those limbs still have their own health, the core of the creature defends with a higher armor score than normal. Daikaiju have the armor score which the limbs use, and the maximum armor score that the core uses instead of having both an armor and evasion score. Daikaiju combat could either focus on taking out the limbs to weaken the creature's core, or hoping to bypass the limbs by piercing the maximum armor score of the tougher core. I have always been fascinated by kaiju, especially Godzilla. Name one thing better than a giant monster rampaging through the city that doubles as an anti-war, anti-nuclear weapons metaphor. That's right, you can't. And in a world of a mysterious virus that can transform literally anything into a monster, the ability to fight giants was unquestionably a necessity. Ever since I first incorporated the mechanic for Daikaiju, I have been begging the Virus King to tell me how I could incorporate even bigger monsters into the game. And very recently His Majesty bestowed the answer unto this wretched peasant, the Dominion Daikaiju, a creature as large as the battlefield itself. Instead of having limbs to defend itself and boost its armor like the regular Daikaiju, the Dominion Daikaiju has multiple heads that burrow underground. If the player defeats a set amount of heads, Then the core will reveal itself with the remainder of the heads. Currently, there is only one Dominion Daikaiju, the Mammoth Hydra. It's a creature with 18 snake-like heads covered in woolly mammoth fur and necks as thick as trees. Defeating 9 of its heads will cause the core to reveal itself, making this a 2-phase boss fight. The warm-up of hunting down the heads, which gives the players a hint as to what the creature's full form will be like, and, of course, the reveal of the full thing. The core of the creature is a beating red gem connecting the 9 remaining heads to a massive snake-like tail under the battlefield. The only way to slay one of these behemoths is to cut down each of its heads. It's a mechanic I still need to test and iron out the kinks, but I have high hopes that it will be one of the best additions to the game. Saturday ushered in the first weekend. I couldn't bring myself to do anything. My mind was overheated, and my body was heavy like bricks. The beast of burnout had cleaved through my muscle fibers and left me to bleed out. But I used that weekend to recuperate, as much as I could. On the 7th day, I was pushed into testing the rough draft of the character sheet against my shredded will. We made an apex predator named Theodore, a lumberjack who was well acquainted with the natural world from before the virus's invasion. Obviously, there were problems with the first test and visual bits that needed cleaned up, like the disciplines chart, but honestly, I don't remember much of what that first sheet was like. I was barely cognizant when we used it. I do remember that the test prompted me to add origins to the character creation, so that characters could be more easily defined and have a few extra bonuses at the start. Theodore may have been a survivor at heart, but before adding the origin, he didn't have the skills of one. On the 8th day, I cleaned up the character sheet as well as expanded on the classes and items and enemies. This could be said in the next few days, just fleshing out the bones and trying to fill in enough to make a playable game, while unsuccessfully warding off the phantoms of burnout. By the 11th day, that's second Thursday, the phantoms had won. I would say I threw up my hands and called it playable, but I didn't even have the energy to move my arms. For the 12th, 13th, and 14th days, I entered a vegetative state, only to awaken at the end to force my responsibilities unto someone else to create more test characters and prove that my game was indeed playable. Then on the 15th day, I realized I forgot to assign XP values to any of the enemies. Whoops! Nah, I always use milestone level up anyways. Now might be a good time to mention those enemies I forgot to assign XP to. There are 5 categories of NPC in the game, 4 of which are meant to be hostiles. First are the animals, mostly what you would expect. This is a survival horror game, so sometimes you need to fight nature and sometimes you need to harvest meat. I touched on food briefly earlier. It's an item which can be used to gain temporary buffs or to heal, but primarily it's there for the hunger gauge mechanic. Something in there for the field of survival horror, but also something I intended to completely ignore while playing it myself. There are a few things categorized as animals which you might not expect to be there. The stitched creatures and cryptids. Stitched creatures are what they sound like, unnatural things which are sewn together and which were not born from the virus. There isn't much info on where these things come from, only what they look like, what they can do, and what agony they are in. Then there are the cryptids, like Mothman, strange creatures of legend which can be found in the area and whom also did not derive from the virus. Next are the human NPCs. These can be citizens of the stronghold or survivors still living in the infected world. Missions could revolve around rescuing these people or delivering supplies to them while fighting or sneaking through the infected world. Then there are your fellow engineered that you can run across. They can aid you on your missions or trade items with the party. However, there are also the cultists, the only human enemies in the game. Humans who live in tandem with their virus overlords, who aspire to become like them one day. They live in strict hierarchies with their virus priest at the peak. Their masters keep them healthy, slowly incubating the infection until the time is right to change them into monsters like them. That brings us to the infected, a category of the weakest monsters to be created by the virus. Infected are weak, mindless creatures who have lifespans as short as a month and seek out only to carry out their programming. to spread and replicate. Infected, which die by natural causes, which is to say, the virus breaking down the host organism, will explode in a last-ditch effort to spread its infection. Infected, which are hunted down by the engineered, are much less likely to explode. Any infected creature which is killed decomposes within minutes, making it difficult, but not impossible, to harvest from the bodies. The fourth category of enemy is the mutated. Creatures changed by the virus which are also incapable of spreading the infection themselves. Mutated are generally characterized as being more independent creatures. If a mutated works with another infected creature, it is either because the mutated bound that creature to its own will, or was bound to the other creature's will. They operate in a barbaric master and servant mindset. Mutated occupy a middle ground in terms of power, stronger than the infected, but weaker than the final category of creature, viruses. The fifth category are possibly immortal creatures of near limitless power. Viruses can be more intelligent than humans and are highly infectious. They are the superior to all other categories of infectious creature in every way. And yet, there is something above them. The bosses, which exist in a gray area being both viruses and above viruses. The world bosses constitute 6 viruses, the end-all, be-all of the game. There is one for each strain type. For instance, there is a mimetic strain boss which resides in the Library of Congress, and has warped all of DC into a twisted museum, a monument to its stolen knowledge. It distinguishes itself as a man wearing dark sunglasses and a black trench coat. It has the power to remove memories directly from an object in the form of a book. In its true form, it's possible for it to even remove your sense of self and rip it asunder, killing you instantly. As for the King Strain final boss, the strongest strain in the game, it is not the Virus King himself, for that would be an unwinnable matchup, but his virus generals, lookalikes created by the Virus King with a fraction of his power, and the thing which acts as the current final boss of the game. There are a handful of things which I don't remember exactly when they came about, but which still need to be mentioned, like adaptations. Viruses are things which evolve rapidly, and the engineered have their powers, so they can evolve too. Well, technically adapt since it's the same being and not happening over the course of multiple generations, but anyways. While leveling up does all the things you would expect, boosting your stats and giving you cool new abilities, it's not the main mechanism for strengthening your character. Adaptations give players a skill tree of endless branches to develop your character's unique strengths, removing any limit on how strong your character can become. The way that this feature works is after a player has accomplished a particularly arduous feat, or has successfully repeated an action some number of times, they can request the opportunity to acquire an adaptation, or the GM may gift them that chance at their discretion. The player and GM would then negotiate first what level of adaptation this feat would earn, of which there are 5 rarities. Then the player would be able to choose any single adaptation from that rarity, so long as the GM would agree the character has worked towards it through roleplay, gameplay, or has met the prerequisite if applicable. Adaptations can vary from small stat boosts to passive abilities or unique attacks. Theoretically, a game could run indefinitely without the player character stagnating. Using adaptations like Fruits of Your Labor can boost a key score by +1 and can be acquired up to 6 times. Or the adaptation Dragon's Fire would give your character the ability to breathe fire. Much of the game centers around how you build your character, and adaptations will give near endless possible builds for your characters. I'm sure this feature will have some bugs that still need ironed out, but that's what playtesting's for. Which brings us to the playtest, and oh boy, what a mess. So, I made this game, or at least got it to a playable state, in a short 2-week period, right? I started back on June 3rd, and somehow, a few months have passed. Why is the math not mathing right? Well, if you've tried to schedule a D&D game or something of the like, you might know how tough it can be to get everyone's schedules to align. I could have rearranged the stars before putting a group together, but that is a different, long-winded story. Eventually, I was able to arrange a test game, and I was able to do so before coming up with a name for the game. I don't know if that makes it any better. So our first session, which I like to call session -1, consisted of me explaining the rules so everyone would be able to play the game. This already put us 2 steps ahead of our disastrous Pathfinder game, which is yet another long-winded story. Our session 0 was making characters, which went very smoothly, except for everyone showing up at different times. But actually making the characters was easy. Then we finally made it to our first session, and somehow, even after all that time, I was still not ready. Embarrassing to admit, but I floundered as a GM. I expected my players to use the scavenge discipline more than once. Thought they might have specific gear in mind, and that they might look for necessary components to build that gear. I was hoping they might have a direction for how to build their characters, or at least to have looked through the crafting section of the rules. Since they didn't do that, it left my players with nothing to defend themselves, and they almost lost a party member to some wild boar. If they had only gone through the crafting sections for themselves, maybe they could have fought more than just some boars. My plans for the first session were already vague, but after that first encounter, I realized I had to change plans. If I escalated the fights like I planned, then it would have ended in a party wipe. They hadn't even encountered any infected yet. But maybe it was naive of me to expect so much from my players. I was throwing them into the deep end of an unfinished game, with only an overview of the rules to keep them afloat. Without the armor and evasion bonuses from the gear I intended for them to craft, the game seemed too difficult. I wanted the game to feel like they were always on the back foot, but they felt like they were dead on arrival. I tried to stress how important scavenging and crafting would be at the start, but my players still didn't have enough direction. At least that was my mistake and not the game's. We all floundered in the deep end, but I still got some good input from that session. The fact that your character doesn't start battle ready seems to have been too vast a departure from what they were used to. The problem with cumulative armor scores and evasion scores should be fixed now. After that session, I tweaked the character creation so you select 3 pieces of low-level gear. My intent is that your character begins weak enough to be on the back foot, but strong enough to feel like there's a fighting chance. It will also force players to look at the crafting section, so they will hopefully begin planning a build for their character. Another change is that not all enemies roll a d20 to hit. Some creatures roll 2d8, 2d6, or some other combination. The idea here, which I graciously stole from one of my players, is that the roll is capped at a lower number so that enemies should have a harder time hitting you. On the other end, there's a boss who rolls 3d8 to hit, capping out at 24, which should make it more challenging than your average foe. It is a good thing natural 20s and nat 1s aren't really part of this game, at least not in the rules, or else that change would have caused so many headaches. After yet more time rearranging the stars, we finally got to our second session, and I am proud to say I learned my lesson as a GM. I had an outline for the session broken up into 4 parts, an equal mix of roleplay opportunities and combat testing. Admittedly, I messed up the first encounter. There's an enemy called a Wandering Winter Spirit, which will freeze the ground during combat to make moving more difficult. This infected has a unique gimmick that protects it from harm while hiding under the ground. But when I introduced it, I had it already out of the ground, and so it died before getting to do anything. Another instance of me messing up and not the game. So, oops. Speaking of my mistakes, I realized I forgot how my own rules worked in that first session. I treated my players as if they were normal types when the engineer do have a strain. Essentially, they should have had resistances to all the boar's attacks. I made sure to fix that in our second session, and using the chart correctly did change things. More than I expected, even. The combat with 2 Arctic vultures and a Wandering Winter Spirit went much easier than with the boars. I'm not sure if that was because I had them level up, or because the resistances chart, or because the vultures had some unlucky rolls, but my players won that fight much easier than their last encounter. After the fight, I had them stumble across a creature called the Knowing, a parasite that latches onto solid structures like trees and which devour information. These are non-aggressive creatures meant as a way for players to get information at a cost. They need to trade something to the knowing. Unfortunately, this creature was less impactful than I was hoping. I was really excited about this one, but it was either too weird or too confusing for my players, and they were unsure what to do. After stumbling with the strange creature for a moment, they were given a new direction and ended up finding the survivors they were sent to rescue. This was another chance to test out an enemy not meant for combat. It was a creature which copies the appearance of a human to lure in unsuspecting victims. When one gets close enough to the creature, it opens horizontally, revealing a massive maw to clench down on its next meal. This encounter ended up going better than I could have expected. My players were very creative in trying to discover which one was the human and which was an infected in disguise. They made use of the elements of the game like the viral sense discipline, which allows an engineer to sense infected creatures in the area. And they made a creative use of a vaccine by jabbing one into the fake. Like the Phoenix Down in Final Fantasy, using a vaccine on an infected creature causes them pain, which forced this one to reveal its true form before it had a chance to use a sneak attack. I don't have as clear a takeaway from the second session as I did the first. With the first, I knew exactly what changes needed to be done immediately after the session ended. With this one, however, it feels more like the game worked as intended. I made a few mistakes running the game, and my players weren't too sure what to do when faced with the knowing, but otherwise the game went very well. On one hand, it's nice to just say it worked, but on the other, I feel like there must be something I missed. After a month or more, I got my answer as to what I was missing when our third and final session finally rolled around. The party had found the survivors they were tasked with rescuing, and on their way back to the stronghold, the ground beneath them cracked under the gravity of two Daikaiju duking it out. While money doesn't exist in this world, we did take the time to place bets on which giant would come out on top. The party dropped into an abandoned mine and were presented a choice between a rickety bridge and a dark tunnel. They chose the tunnel and found 3 monsters waiting at the end. There were 2 weak enemies and a strong one, and somehow it ended up taking an hour to fight them. Now, 10 minutes of that hour were wasted by the first player in the turn order trying to pull up his character sheet. That same player also just kinda takes forever to take his turns anyways. Besides that, I'm not sure why the fight took so long. It only lasted 3 or 4 turns, and I know other games with an action economy don't take that long for one encounter. I am assuming it took so long because this was the first ever campaign of the game. Thus, no one knew what their abilities did, which slowed down combat because everyone needed to stop and read the descriptions of every action they could do. My current theory is that the game's combat doesn't need adjusted to speed it up, and that it will naturally get faster the better the players know the game. The damage done in combat, however, that did need adjusted, and I've been playing with the numbers trying to find the right balance. One player became very frustrated with the type advantage chart because we happened to face a number of enemies that resisted him. On one hand, this is a problem I had already taken into account. Crafting and item loadouts would give your character access to different damage types and could even resist damage that would otherwise be effective. On the other hand, they never used crafting, so they were only ever working with the random items they would chance upon. Additionally, I chose the enemies based off the environment they were in and didn't take into account my player's strain types, which led to one player having a really bad time. To try and avoid an issue like this in the future, I am incentivizing crafting even more. First, by listing a crafting ability for each class at level 1. I want crafting to be front and center during character creation, that it is something you can and should do. Next, I'll add descriptions of some outposts set up by the stronghold or crafting benches left behind by the wandering steampunk. That way a prospective GM could easily prompt the party to make more items before throwing them into a nest of viruses. And if the party is low on materials, then the GM could give the party some items by saying, hey, they were left behind at this crafting bench. For our last session, I had 3 encounters planned, but after how long the first one took, we decided to skip straight to the final boss, where I finally got to test my Daikaiju feature. The Daikaiju are definitely made for a more drawn out battle, but I think the second combat actually took less time than the first. despite there still being 2 weaker enemies accompanying the powerful Daikaiju, and the Daikaiju having more health than the entire first encounter combined, this was still a shorter fight. This is part of why I'm working under the assumption I don't need to adjust combat length, at least not yet. The Daikaiju did work as intended, thank Blue, although I need to adjust the descriptions. Actually playing with one showed me things I forgot to mention or never considered. Since the Daikaiju is divided into its main body and its limbs, one of my players asked what happens if a limb is inflicted with a status effect. I hadn't considered this, and decided if one part of it was affected, then that should apply to the whole thing, which has some silly implications. If part of its body is concealed, I guess that means its whole body could have the obscured or stealth status. Another thing I got to test with this session was terrains. Specific spaces in the map that may apply an effect based on whether you stop on or move across that space. There isn't much to say here. It worked. It can add some extra interest or complexity to a map if the GM wants to use them. So, woo. Our final session left me with about a dozen notes of things to add or adjust, and I'm just glad to have specific feedback to work off of. Despite the amount of work I need to put in after our last session, I still feel better about the game than when I walked away from our second session with no notes, no feedback, no adjustments to be made. It's plenty of work that I'm still trying to implement, but at least it'll be problems I know have been fixed. Something I forgot to mention in this version of the script, which, if you couldn't tell, I've had half a dozen attempts at making this video, but kept scrapping them because I hate talking about something I made. But I forgot to make mention of one point. I've heard a lot of gripes about the current state of D&D and what Hasbro is pushing from it. I wanted to take a moment to mention how many other games there are, like Pathfinder, Starfinder, the World of Darkness games, and I guess I'll throw my own into the mix now. I've also found some that I want to look more into, like Powered by the Apocalypse or Call of Cthulhu. But more importantly, since I keep hearing complaints about the new D&D rules or Hasbro trying to push their AI-generated garbage into the most popular fantasy game, I just want to remind people that you don't have to play their game, and you don't have to play it how they say. These games are pen and paper. We get to decide everything here. Well, that brings us to the end. In just 2 weeks, I made a functional game. 5 months and 200 pages later, and I'm still trying to get it to a complete state. I've been referring to this as a pre-alpha in my head, and I really wish I could call it an alpha build, but I won't do that until I've gotten through my mental checklist of every necessary component. I think all that's left is getting each class to level 10, since that is my current max level. Quick addendum. I might have that done by the time I finally get this put out there. So, woo, alpha build. A funny little side tangent. So, I saw a stupid expensive thing go for pre-order around the time I started this whole project. And to make sure I didn't make the dumb purchase, I said I could only buy it if this video got 10,000 views. Obviously, that won't happen, so I'm safe. Although I did check the other day and it was still in stock. If someone actually stuck around long enough to hear this bit, leave a comment telling me to buy it or making fun of me, something funny. Also, please leave a comment letting me know what you thought of all this. I spent a lot of time and way too much effort working on this game. Oh, I finally came up with a name for it, or at least a working title. I've been calling it Xenophage, which I think describes it well. It is all about a weird and otherworldly virus after all. Let me know if you like the name. If you have a better name than that, definitely tell me. But also, just let me know any thoughts on the whole thing. Mechanics, enemies, the setting, anything.